New chat. Write a complete YouTube story based on this title. The cook's crazy invention that kept German U-boats from finding Allied convoys. The story must be divided into exactly 5 parts. Each part should be around 2,000 words long. Write in third-person narration. The main character should be a brave, emotionally strong female soldier who is insulted, mocked, or underestimated in the beginning. The story should develop emotionally and realistically, showing her strength, sacrifice, and journey to justice or redemption. Make the setting believable, a small town, military base, or suburban area in the USA. Include emotional beats, character development, moments of injustice, and end the story with a powerful or satisfying twist like revenge, respect earned, or exposure of truth. Language must be clean, simple, and engaging, suitable for an older American audience, age 60+, and optimized for voice narration. Avoid complex words. Use clear emotional language. Each part should smoothly continue the story and keep the viewer hooked. Show more. The cook's crazy invention that kept German U-boats from finding Allied convoys. Part 1, The Kitchen Warrior. Lieutenant Margaret Hayes stood at attention in the cramped office of Commander Robert Sullivan at the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. It was April 1942, and the war in the Atlantic was going badly. Very badly. "A cook," the commander said, not bothering to hide the mockery in his voice. "They've assigned me a cook to solve our U-boat problem." Margaret kept her eyes forward, her jaw tight. She was 32 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. Before the war, she had been a research chemist at a university in Boston. But the Navy didn't care about that. They saw a woman, and women belonged in kitchens. "Permission to speak, sir," Margaret said. "Denied," Sullivan replied, shuffling papers on his desk. "You'll report to the mess hall at 600 hours tomorrow. Dismissed." Margaret saluted and turned on her heel. She walked through the corridors of the administrative building, passing groups of young sailors who barely glanced at her. To them, she was just another woman in uniform, probably a secretary or a nurse. They had no idea what she was capable of. The truth was, Margaret had volunteered for the Navy with one purpose: to use her scientific knowledge to help win the war. She had a doctorate in chemistry and had published papers on hydrocaustics, the science of sound traveling through water. But when she arrived at Norfolk, the assignment officer took one look at her and said, "We need women in food services. You can cook, can't you?" She had tried to explain, tried to show them her credentials, but they laughed. One officer actually patted her on the head like she was a child. So now she cooked. She peeled potatoes. She served beans and bread to sailors who were about to go out and face death in the cold Atlantic waters. And every night she lay awake in her small quarters, listening to the sounds of the base, thinking about the boys who wouldn't come back. Because the German U-boats were winning. Everyone on the base knew it, even if the newspapers back home tried to hide the truth. The submarines prowled the East Coast like wolves, sinking merchant ships faster than America could build them. The convoys that carried food, fuel, and weapons to Britain were being slaughtered. In just the first few months of 1942, over 200 Allied ships had gone to the bottom. The problem was simple but deadly. The U-boats could hear the convoys coming from miles away. The sound of propellers churning through water traveled far in the ocean. The German submarines would lie in wait, silent and invisible until a convoy came near. Then they would strike with torpedoes, often at night, and disappear before the escort ships could find them. Margaret knew there had to be a way to solve this. Sound was her specialty. She understood how it moved through water, how it bounced and bent and traveled in ways that seemed almost magical. But nobody would listen to her. In the mess hall, she worked alongside 3 other women: Betty, a cheerful blonde from Ohio; Patricia, a quiet redhead from Maine; and Dorothy, an older woman with gray streaks in her hair who had lost her son at Pearl Harbor. "You're thinking again," Dorothy said one afternoon as they prepared dinner for 300 sailors. "I can always tell. You get this look in your eyes like you're solving equations in your head." Margaret smiled slightly, just thinking about the convoys. "We all think about the convoys, honey," Betty chimed in, her hands working automatically as she kneaded bread dough. "My brother's on a destroyer out there. Every night I pray he comes home safe." Patricia nodded silently. Her husband was on a merchant vessel. "It's the sound," Margaret said, almost to herself. The propellers are too loud. The U-boats track them by sound. If we could just mask the noise somehow or create interference. There you go again with your science talk, Betty said, not unkindly. Save your brain for the cooking, Maggie. Leave the war to the men. Margaret bit her tongue. Betty meant well, but the words still stung. That evening, after the dinner service was over and the mess hall was clean, Margaret walked down to the docks. She often came here when she needed to think. The smell of salt and diesel fuel filled the air. Ships of all sizes were tied up at the piers. Destroyers, corvettes, minesweepers, and the slow, vulnerable merchant vessels that carried the supplies. She watched as sailors loaded cargo, shouting to each other over the rumble of engines. These men were brave. They went out knowing that death might be waiting for them beneath the waves, and she was stuck in a kitchen. "You're that cook, aren't you?" Margaret turned. A young ensign stood behind her, maybe 20 years old, with sandy hair and a fresh face that hadn't yet seen combat. "I'm Lieutenant Hayes," she said firmly. "Right, sorry, ma'am." He looked embarrassed. I heard someone say you used to be a scientist or something." "I am a scientist," Margaret corrected. "I specialized in hydrocaustics." The ensign's eyes widened. "Really? That's exactly what we need. The sound problem, I mean, everyone's talking about it. We can't figure out how to keep the U-boats from hearing us." "I know," Margaret said. "So why aren't you working on it? Why are you in the mess hall?" Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Because I'm a woman, ensign, and apparently women are better suited for peeling potatoes than saving lives." The young man's face fell. "That's not right." "No," Margaret agreed, "it's not." She walked back to her quarters that night with a familiar frustration burning in her chest. But something else was there too, a small spark of an idea that had been forming in her mind for weeks. Sound traveled through water. That was the problem. But what if you could create a barrier of sound, a wall of noise that would confuse the hydrophones the Germans used to listen for ships? It wouldn't make the convoys silent, but it might make them impossible to pinpoint. The idea had come to her while cooking, of all things. She had been boiling water for pasta, watching the bubbles rise and pop. Bubbles, air in water, air disrupted sound. That was basic physics. What if you could create a curtain of bubbles around a convoy? Millions and millions of tiny air bubbles, rising continuously from devices towed behind the ships. The bubbles would create random noise, a kind of acoustic smoke screen. The U-boats would hear something, but they wouldn't be able to tell exactly where the ships were or how many there were. It was crazy, it was simple, it might actually work. But who would listen to a cook? Margaret lay in her bunk that night, staring at the ceiling. She could hear one of the other women crying softly in the next room. Probably Patricia, thinking about her husband out there in the dark Atlantic. Tomorrow, Margaret decided, tomorrow she would find a way to make someone listen. She didn't care if they laughed at her. She didn't care if they mocked her. Too many people were dying. She closed her eyes and thought about bubbles rising through water, creating chaos in the acoustic world beneath the waves. It was such a simple idea, almost childishly simple. Sometimes, she thought, the simplest ideas were the best ones. But first, she had to convince the most stubborn, prideful group of men in the world, the United States Navy. Margaret woke at 5 in the morning, as she did every day. She dressed in her uniform, making sure every button was perfect, every crease sharp. If she was going to fight for respect, she needed to look the part. At 600 hours, she reported to the mess hall and began her duties. But her mind was elsewhere. She was composing a letter in her head, a formal proposal for her bubble curtain idea. She would type it up during her lunch break and submit it through the proper channels. "You're distracted today," Dorothy observed, cracking eggs into a massive bowl. "More than usual." "I'm going to submit a proposal," Margaret said quietly, "for a way to protect the convoys." Dorothy's hand stopped moving. She looked at Margaret with a mixture of concern and sadness. "Honey, I know you're smart. I know you've got all those degrees, but they're not going to listen. They never do." "I have to try." "You'll just get yourself in trouble. They don't like women who speak up." Margaret turned to face her friend fully. "Dorothy, your son died at Pearl Harbor. My cousin died on a merchant ship last month. How many more people have to die before we stop worrying about whether men like us speaking up?" Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "You're right. God help us, you're right. What do you need?" "Time to write, and maybe some coffee." "I can give you both." Dorothy said, managing a small smile. During her lunch break, Margaret went to the administrative building and borrowed a typewriter. She sat in an empty office and typed out her proposal in clear, simple language. She explained the science, the concept, and how it could be tested. She included rough diagrams and calculations. When she finished, she read it over 3 times, making small corrections. It was good. It was more than good. It was brilliant. Even the most stubborn officer would have to see the potential. She submitted the proposal to Commander Sullivan's office that afternoon. 3 days passed, then a week. Margaret heard nothing. She continued her duties in the mess hall, but the silence gnawed at her. Had they even read it? Had they thrown it in the trash the moment they saw a woman's signature? On the 10th day, she received a summons to Commander Sullivan's office. Her heart pounded as she climbed the stairs. This was it. Maybe they had seen the value in her idea. Maybe they were ready to take her seriously. She knocked on the door. "Enter," Sullivan's voice barked. Margaret stepped inside. Sullivan sat behind his desk, and 2 other officers stood nearby, Commander James Peterson and Lieutenant Commander Harold Briggs. All 3 men were looking at her with expressions that ranged from amusement to barely concealed contempt. "Lieutenant Hayes," Sullivan said, holding up her proposal, "what is this nonsense?" Margaret's stomach sank, but she kept her voice steady. "It's a proposal for protecting convoys from U-boat detection, sir." "Bubbles," Peterson said, and he actually laughed. "You want to fight submarines with bubbles?" "Yes, sir. Air bubbles create acoustic interference. They would mask the sound signature of the convoy, making it difficult for U-boats to—" "We know what bubbles do, Lieutenant," Briggs interrupted. "We're not idiots." "Then you understand the scientific principle," Margaret said. "What we understand," Sullivan said, leaning forward, "is that you're a cook. You're not an engineer, you're not an acoustics expert. You're a woman who serves food, and you need to stay in your lane." "I have a doctorate in chemistry with a focus on hydrocaustics," Margaret said, her voice rising slightly despite her best efforts to stay calm. "I've published research papers. I've studied sound propagation in water for 6 years. I am exactly the kind of expert you need." "What you are," Peterson said coldly, "is insubordinate. You're here to cook, not to tell the Navy how to fight a war." Margaret felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Denied," Sullivan said. "Lieutenant Hayes, you're dismissed, and if you waste our time with any more of these ridiculous ideas, there will be consequences. Do I make myself clear?" Margaret stood frozen for a moment. 3 men who knew less than her about acoustic science were dismissing a potentially war-winning idea because she was a woman. Boys were dying in the Atlantic, and these men were letting their pride kill them. "Crystal clear, sir," she said through gritted teeth. She saluted and left the office. As soon as the door closed behind her, she heard them laughing. Margaret walked back to the mess hall in a daze of rage and despair. She had known it would be difficult, but some part of her had hoped that the urgency of war, the sheer number of deaths, would make them see reason. She had been naive. "I can see it didn't go well," Dorothy said when Margaret returned. "They laughed at me," Margaret said quietly. "They called it nonsense." Betty and Patricia had stopped working to listen. "What will you do now?" Betty asked. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll build it myself." The other women stared at her. "You'll what?" Dorothy asked. "I'll build a prototype. I'll prove it works. Then they'll have to listen." "Maggie, that's crazy," Betty said. "Where would you even get the materials? How would you test it?" "I'll figure it out," Margaret said. She was already making a mental list. She needed pipes, an air compressor, some way to regulate the air flow, and she needed access to water deep enough to test the acoustic properties. "This could get you court-martialed," Patricia said quietly. It was the most she'd said all week. "Maybe," Margaret admitted, "but it's the right thing to do." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret became a woman on a mission. During her off hours, she scrounged materials from around the base. She traded cigarette rations for pipe fittings. She borrowed an old air compressor from a maintenance shed that looked like it hadn't been used in months. She sketched designs on scraps of paper during slow moments in the kitchen. The young ensign she had met at the docks, his name was David Chen, became an unexpected ally. He had a background in engineering and was appalled that the Navy had rejected her idea. He helped her refine the design and smuggled technical manuals to her. You know we could both get in serious trouble for this, David said one evening as they worked in a storage building far from the main base. I know, Margaret said, adjusting a valve on her prototype. But I keep thinking about all those boys out there. They deserve every possible chance to come home. David nodded. My older brother is on a destroyer. He's been through 2 U-boat attacks already. He says it's like being hunted by ghosts. You can't see them, can't hear them. They just appear and start killing. Margaret's hands stilled. Then we're doing the right thing. It took another week, but finally the prototype was ready. It was crude, basically a long pipe with dozens of small holes drilled along its length, connected to the air compressor. When activated, it would release a steady stream of bubbles. The question was whether it would work. Margaret and David borrowed a small boat one night, technically without permission, and took the device out into the bay. They lowered it into the water and started the compressor. Even in the darkness, they could see the effect. A curtain of bubbles rose from the submerged pipe, churning the water into white foam. It's working, David breathed. The bubbles are definitely creating acoustic interference. I can barely hear our engine over the noise. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. We need to test it properly, with hydrophones to measure the actual sound disruption. I might be able to borrow some, David said. There's a research lab on the other side of the base. Over the next few days, they conducted more tests. The results were promising, better than promising. The bubble curtain created so much acoustic confusion that it was nearly impossible to pinpoint the location of the boat's engine. From a distance, the hydrophones picked up only random noise. Margaret documented everything carefully. She took measurements, made charts, photographed the setup. This time, when she presented her findings, there would be no room for doubt. But she knew Sullivan and his cronies would never give her a fair hearing. She needed to go over their heads. She needed someone with real authority, someone who cared more about winning the war than about keeping women in their place. The problem was, she had no idea who that person might be. Then fate intervened. Admiral Thomas Hardcastle was scheduled to visit Norfolk Naval Base for an inspection. He was one of the Navy's top officers, responsible for convoy operations along the entire East Coast. If anyone would understand the importance of her invention, it would be him. Margaret knew she had one chance, one opportunity to make her case. If she failed, she would likely be court-martialed for insubordination and unauthorized use of Navy resources. If she succeeded, she might save thousands of lives. "Are you sure about this?" Dorothy asked the night before the Admiral's visit. The women were sitting in their quarters, and Margaret had just explained her plan. "No," Margaret admitted. "I'm terrified, but I have to try." "Then we're with you," Betty said firmly. Patricia nodded in agreement. "If they try to punish you, they'll have to punish all of us," Dorothy added. "We'll say we were part of it from the beginning." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you, all of you." That night she barely slept. She rehearsed what she would say to the Admiral, went over her evidence again and again. By dawn, she was exhausted but determined. The Admiral was scheduled to inspect the mess hall at 1,000 hours. Margaret made sure she was there, her uniform perfect, her documentation hidden in her jacket. When Admiral Hardcastle walked in, a tall man with iron-gray hair and sharp blue eyes, Commander Sullivan and his officers flanked him, all smiles and sycophantic attention. Margaret's moment came during the inspection of the kitchen. The Admiral paused to compliment the cleanliness of the facility, and Margaret stepped forward. "Admiral Hardcastle, sir, permission to speak." Sullivan's face went red. "Lieutenant Hayes, this is not the time." "I'll decide that, Commander," the Admiral said, his eyes focusing on Margaret with interest. "You have something to say, Lieutenant?" "Yes, sir. I have information critical to convoy protection. I've developed a device that could save thousands of lives." The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Admiral Hardcastle studied Margaret for a long moment. Commander Sullivan looked like he might explode, his face a deep shade of crimson. The other officers shifted uncomfortably. "You've developed a device," the Admiral repeated, his tone neutral. "And what exactly does this device do?" Margaret's heart hammered, but her voice came out steady. "It creates an acoustic barrier using air bubbles, sir. It masks the sound signature of convoy ships, making it extremely difficult for U-boats to locate them using hydrophones." Sullivan stepped forward. Admiral, I apologize for this interruption. Lieutenant Hayes is assigned to food services. She has no authority to— I asked her a question, Commander, the Admiral said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. I'd like to hear her answer. He turned back to Margaret. You're telling me you can hide our ships from German submarines using bubbles? Yes, sir, I've built and tested a prototype. I have documentation of the results. The Admiral glanced at Sullivan, then back at Margaret. Something flickered in his eyes, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. Show me. Sir, this is highly irregular, Peterson protested. She's just a cook, she has no technical training. I have a doctorate in chemistry with a specialization in hydrocaustics from Boston University, Margaret interrupted. I've published 4 papers on sound propagation in water. Before the war, I was on track to become a full professor. The Admiral's eyebrows rose. Then why are you serving food? Because when I volunteered for the Navy, sir, I was told that women belong in kitchens, not laboratories. A heavy silence fell over the room. The Admiral's jaw tightened. Commander Sullivan, why wasn't I informed that we have a hydrocaustics expert on this base? Sullivan stammered. Sir, the assignment office didn't. She's a woman, sir. I can see that, Commander. I'm asking why a trained scientist was assigned to peel potatoes while we're losing ships to U-boats at an alarming rate. The Admiral's voice was cold as winter steel. Lieutenant Hayes, you said you have documentation. Yes, sir. Margaret pulled out her folder with shaking hands. The Admiral took it and began flipping through the pages. His expression remained neutral, but Margaret could see his eyes moving quickly, taking in the diagrams, the test results, the calculations. After several minutes, he looked up. This is remarkable work, Lieutenant. How long have you been working on this? 3 weeks, sir, most of it on my own time. And you conducted these tests where? Margaret hesitated. This was where she might be court-martialed. In the bay, sir, at night. I borrowed a boat and some equipment. You stole government property, Briggs said triumphantly. I borrowed it, Margaret corrected. Everything has been returned. The Admiral closed the folder. Commander Sullivan, I want Lieutenant Hayes transferred to my staff immediately. She'll report to the Research and Development section. Sullivan's mouth fell open. Sir, you can't be serious. She's completely undermined the chain of command. She stole equipment, She showed initiative, intelligence, and dedication while you and your officers wasted her talents. The Admiral cut him off. How many other qualified people do you have cooking food, Commander? How many engineers are scrubbing toilets? How many doctors are filing paperwork? We assign personnel according to regulations, sir. Your regulations are costing us the war, the Admiral said flatly. He turned to Margaret. Lieutenant Hayes, I want you to brief my technical staff this afternoon. Bring your prototype, your documentation, everything. If this works, and I believe it might, we need to implement it immediately. Yes, sir, Margaret said, barely believing what she was hearing. And Lieutenant, this took courage, real courage. The Navy needs more officers willing to challenge bad decisions, even at personal risk. Margaret felt tears threatening, but she blinked them back. Thank you, sir. The Admiral swept out of the kitchen, his aides scrambling to follow. Sullivan remained behind, glaring at Margaret with undisguised hatred. You just made a powerful enemy, Lieutenant, he said quietly. I made a powerful ally, Margaret replied. And I did the right thing, that's all that matters. That afternoon, Margaret stood in front of a room full of naval engineers and acoustics specialists. These were serious men with advanced degrees, men who had spent their careers studying the problems she was trying to solve. She was terrified, but when she began her presentation, explaining the physics of sound propagation and how air bubbles could create acoustic interference, the fear faded. This was her world. This was what she knew better than almost anyone alive. The men listened intently. They asked questions, good questions, technical questions that showed they understood the principles. A few were skeptical, but most seemed genuinely interested. The key advantage, Margaret explained, is that we don't need to make our ships silent. We just need to make them hard to locate precisely. A U-boat captain hears noise, lots of noise, but he can't tell if it's one ship or 10 or exactly where they are. He has to surface to use his periscope, and that makes him vulnerable to our escorts. How much air pressure would be required? One engineer asked. Based on my tests, about 80 pounds per square inch, maintained continuously. Each ship would need its own compressor system. The weight alone would be less than one torpedo, Margaret interrupted gently, and the fuel consumption would be minimal compared to the ship's main engines. Another engineer, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses, stood up. I've been working on this problem for 6 months. I've tried everything I could think of, special propeller designs, sound-dampening materials, even speed variations to throw off tracking. Nothing worked. He smiled. This is brilliant in its simplicity. Why didn't any of us think of it? Maybe because you weren't cooking pasta and watching water boil, Margaret said, and got a round of laughter. By the end of the meeting, the Admiral's staff had approved her design for immediate testing. They would build a full-scale prototype within 2 weeks and conduct trials in the open ocean. Over those 2 weeks, Margaret worked harder than she ever had in her life. She collaborated with the engineering team, refining the design, working out the technical problems. The men, to her surprise and relief, treated her as an equal. Her gender didn't matter here, only her knowledge and her ideas. David Chen was assigned to help her, and Dorothy, Betty, and Patricia were given new positions in the administrative offices. Rewards, the Admiral had said, for supporting Margaret's work. You did it, Dorothy said one evening. They were sitting on the dock watching the sunset. You actually changed their minds. Not all of them, Margaret said. Commander Sullivan still hates me. Let him hate, Dorothy replied. He's a small man with small ideas. You're saving lives. The day of the ocean trial arrived. A convoy escort ship, the USS Thorn, had been fitted with Margaret's bubble curtain system. 4 ships would sail together, 3 with the system, 1 without, while a submarine playing the role of a U-boat would try to locate and track them. Margaret stood on the deck of the Admiral's command ship, watching through binoculars. Her heart was in her throat. If this didn't work, she would be humiliated. All her work, all her fighting would be for nothing. The test began. The submarine reported hearing the convoy from 8 miles away, the ship without the bubble curtain. But the 3 ships with Margaret's system. The submarine captain reported only confused acoustic signatures and said he couldn't determine their exact position or number. When the submarine finally did locate them visually, it had to close to within 3 miles, dangerously close range for a submerged boat, where escort ships could easily detect and attack it. The test was a complete success. That night, the Admiral called Margaret to his office. Lieutenant Hayes, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to Lieutenant Commander. I'm also recommending that your bubble curtain system be implemented fleet-wide as quickly as possible. Margaret felt lightheaded. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep working. We need your mind in this war. He paused. I'm also ordering a review of all personnel assignments on this base. If there are other people with valuable skills being wasted, I want to know about it. Thank you, sir. That means more than you know. One more thing, the Admiral said. Commander Sullivan has been reassigned. He'll be commanding a desk in North Dakota for the remainder of the war. Margaret tried to feel some satisfaction at Sullivan's downfall, but she couldn't. She was too tired, too overwhelmed by the sudden change in her circumstances. Within a month, Margaret's bubble curtain system was being installed on convoy ships throughout the Atlantic Fleet. The effect was immediate and dramatic. U-boat attacks dropped by more than 40%. Ships that had been easy prey were suddenly ghosts, impossible to pin down in the acoustic chaos created by millions of rising air bubbles. The Germans were baffled. Their submarine captains reported hearing Allied convoys, but being unable to target them effectively. Some U-boat commanders began to doubt their own hydrophone equipment. Margaret was transferred to Washington, where she joined a top-secret research team developing other anti-submarine technologies. She worked alongside some of the greatest minds in naval warfare, and for the first time in her career, no one questioned her right to be there. But success brought new challenges and new enemies. Part 4, The Price of Victory. The research facility in Washington was housed in a nondescript building near the Navy Yard. From the outside, it looked like any other government office. Inside, it was the cutting edge of naval technology, a place where scientists and engineers worked around the clock to give America an advantage in the war. Margaret's office was small but functional. She had a desk, a blackboard covered in equations, and a window that overlooked the Potomac River. On good days, she could see ships moving up and down the waterway, carrying supplies and personnel. It was November 1942, and the bubble curtain system had been operational for 6 months. The results continued to exceed expectations. Convoy losses had dropped dramatically. Merchant sailors who had been facing near-certain death now had a real chance of survival. Margaret should have been happy. She had achieved everything she set out to do. She had proven her worth, saved countless lives, and earned the respect of her peers. But she wasn't happy. She was exhausted, stressed, and increasingly isolated. The problem started with Captain Gerald Morse. He was the new director of the research facility, a career naval officer with a degree from Annapolis and a reputation as a brilliant tactician. He was also, Margaret quickly discovered, deeply uncomfortable with women in positions of authority. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," Morse said at their first meeting, "I've reviewed your file. Your work on the bubble curtain is impressive. However, now that the system is operational, I believe your particular skills would be better utilized in a support capacity." Margaret felt a familiar sinking feeling. "What kind of support capacity, sir?" "Documentation, technical writing. We need someone to organize the research reports, make sure everything is properly filed and cataloged." "You want me to be a secretary?" Morse's expression hardened. "I want you to contribute to this facility in the way that best serves the Navy. Your expertise in hydrocaustics has been fully applied. Now we need organization and efficiency." "Sir, I have 3 other projects in development. The adaptive frequency modulation system, Those projects will be reassigned to other researchers," Morse interrupted. "Men with more experience in practical applications." Margaret stood her way. "Permission to speak frankly, sir." "Denied. You're dismissed, Lieutenant Commander." Margaret left his office shaking with anger. She went straight to Admiral Hardcastle, but he was away on a tour of the Pacific Fleet. His deputy, a friendly but weak-willed man named Commander Ellis, listened to her complaint with obvious discomfort. "I understand your frustration," Ellis said, "but Captain Morse is well within his authority to reassign personnel as he sees fit. Perhaps you should give it a few weeks, see how things develop." "A few weeks?" Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Commander, we're in the middle of a war. Every day we waste is—" "I'm sorry, Lieutenant Commander Hayes. My hands are tied." Over the next month, Margaret watched as her projects were systematically dismantled. The adaptive frequency modulation system, which could have made Allied sonar even more effective, was shelved. Her work on improved depth charge fusing, which would have made them far more lethal against submarines, was given to an engineer who didn't understand the underlying physics. Meanwhile, Margaret was stuck writing reports and organizing files. It was soul-crushing work, made worse by the knowledge that she could be doing so much more. Her only ally at the facility was a young physicist named Robert Chen, David's cousin, as it turned out. Robert had been working on radar technology, but had hit a dead end. He and Margaret would eat lunch together, commiserating about Captain Morse's leadership. "He's blocking everything," Robert said one day. "Not just your projects. Anyone who suggests something unconventional gets shut down. He only wants to work on incremental improvements to existing systems." "But that's not how breakthroughs happen," Margaret said. "You need people willing to think differently to take risks." "Try telling that to Morse." Margaret had tried multiple times. The captain dismissed every suggestion, every proposal. He seemed personally offended by the idea that a woman might have valuable insights. The situation came to a head in January 1943. A convoy using the bubble curtain system had been attacked by a new type of German submarine, a U-boat equipped with advanced hydrophones that could partially penetrate the acoustic barrier. 3 ships had been sunk. Margaret immediately saw the problem and the solution. The Germans had figured out how to filter the bubble noise and detect the underlying engine sounds. But the fix was simple: vary the bubble density randomly, creating an unpredictable interference pattern that would be much harder to filter. She wrote up the proposal and submitted it to Captain Morse. He rejected it without even reading past the first page. "The system is working adequately," he told her. "We don't need constant modifications from people who want to justify their positions." 3 ships just went down," Margaret said, her voice rising. 90 sailors are dead, and you're saying the system is adequate." "I'm saying that you need to accept your role here, Lieutenant Commander. You had your moment of glory. Be satisfied with that." Margaret stared at him, and suddenly she understood. Morse wasn't just uncomfortable with women in authority. He was jealous. The bubble curtain system had made her famous within the Navy. People knew her name, knew her story. Morse had spent 20 years in the service and had never created anything as significant. "This isn't about efficiency or proper roles," Margaret said quietly. "This is about your ego." Morse's face turned purple. "Your insubordinate, Lieutenant Commander Hayes. I could have you court-martialed for that remark." "Do it," Margaret challenged. "Bring me up on charges. Let's see what Admiral Hardcastle has to say about you blocking modifications that could save lives." For a moment they stood at an impasse. Then Morse smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "I don't need to court-martial you," he said. "I can simply make your life here so miserable that you'll resign, and believe me, I will." He was true to his word. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret's working conditions deteriorated. Her security clearance was reviewed, limiting her access to certain projects. Her office was reassigned to a storage closet in the basement. Other researchers, taking their cue from Morse, began to exclude her from meetings and discussions. Even Robert Chen, who had been her friend, started avoiding her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly when she confronted him. "Morse made it clear that anyone who associates with you will face the same treatment. I have a family to support." Margaret didn't blame him, but the isolation was crushing. She continued to come to work every day, continued to do her assigned tasks, but it felt like slow death. The war was raging across 2 oceans, and she was filing papers in a basement. Then one cold February morning, she received a telegram. Her younger brother, Thomas, a pilot in the Army Air Corps, had been killed in a bombing raid over Germany. He was 24 years old. Margaret sat at her tiny desk in the basement, holding the telegram, and wept. Thomas had been her favorite sibling, the only one who truly understood her passion for science. He used to joke that Margaret would save the world with her equations while he saved it with his bombs. Now he was gone. She went home that day and didn't come back for 3 days. She sat in her small apartment, staring at the wall, wondering what the point of any of it was. She had sacrificed everything, her dignity, her peace of mind, her health, to fight this war. And the people on her own side treated her worse than the enemy. On the 4th day, there was a knock on her door. She almost didn't answer it, but the knocking persisted. It was Dorothy. "How did you find me?" Margaret asked. "I made some calls," Dorothy said, pushing her way inside. "I heard about your brother. I'm so sorry, honey." Margaret broke down again, and Dorothy held her while she cried. "I can't do this anymore," Margaret sobbed. "I can't keep fighting just to be treated like I'm worthless." "You're not worthless," Dorothy said firmly. "You're one of the most valuable people in this whole damn Navy, and I'm not going to let you forget that." Dorothy stayed with her for 2 days, making sure she ate, forcing her to get out of bed, listening when she needed to talk. On the morning of the 3rd day, Dorothy said, "Admiral Hardcastle is back in Washington. I think you should go see him." "What's the point? Morse has authority over the research facility." "The Admiral has authority over Morse. Go tell him what's been happening. Tell him how his precious research center is being run into the ground by a jealous, small-minded bully." Margaret hesitated, but what did she have to lose? That afternoon, she put on her uniform, made sure she looked as professional as possible, and went to the Admiral's office. She had to wait 3 hours for an audience, but finally she was ushered in. Admiral Hardcastle looked older than she remembered. The stress of the war was evident in the lines on his face. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," he said, standing to shake her hand. "I was sorry to hear about your brother." "Thank you, sir. I understand you've been having difficulties at the research facility." Margaret took a deep breath. She had planned a measured, diplomatic speech. Instead, the truth poured out. The reassignments, the blocked proposals, Morse's petty cruelty, the missed opportunity to improve the bubble curtain system. The Admiral listened without interruption, his expression growing darker. When she finished, there was a long silence. "Lieutenant Commander Hayes," the Admiral finally said, "I owe you an apology. When I transferred you to Washington, I thought you would be valued and respected. Clearly, I was wrong." "It's not your fault, sir." "It's absolutely my fault. I should have monitored the situation more closely." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the gray February sky. "Captain Morse is a competent administrator, but he lacks vision, and apparently he lacks basic decency as well. Sir, I didn't come here to get anyone in trouble. I just want to be able to do my job. The Admiral turned back to her. What if I told you I have a different job for you, one where your skills would be truly appreciated? Margaret's heart skipped. What kind of job? There's a top-secret project starting up in California. They're developing advanced sonar systems, acoustic torpedoes, all sorts of cutting-edge technology. They specifically asked for you. They asked for me. By name, apparently your reputation has spread beyond the Navy. The head of the project is a civilian scientist, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Foster. She doesn't care about Navy politics or who's a man and who's a woman. She only cares about results. Margaret felt hope stirring for the first time in months. When would I start? As soon as you can get to San Diego. I'll leave tomorrow, Margaret said. The Admiral smiled. I thought you might say that. There's a train departing at 800, you'll be on it. That evening, Margaret packed her few belongings. She didn't bother saying goodbye to anyone at the research facility. Let them discover her absence in the morning. As she lay in bed that night, she thought about Thomas. He had died fighting for freedom, for a world where people like Margaret could use their talents without being held back by prejudice and pettiness. She would honor his memory by continuing the fight, not with bombs or guns, but with science and determination. The train ride to California took 3 days. Margaret spent most of it staring out the window, watching America roll past, farms and factories, mountains and deserts, small towns and big cities. Somewhere out there in the Atlantic and the Pacific, sailors were fighting and dying. She was going to give them every advantage she could. When she finally arrived in San Diego, exhausted and rumpled, a car was waiting to take her to the research facility. It was located on a military base north of the city, a sprawling complex of laboratories and testing facilities. Dr. Elizabeth Foster met her at the entrance. She was a tall woman in her 50s, with gray hair and intelligent eyes behind thick glasses. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, she said, extending her hand. Welcome to the future of naval warfare. We're going to change the world together. Margaret shook her hand, and for the first time in months she smiled. Let's get started, she said. The San Diego facility was unlike anywhere Margaret had worked before. There were no stuffy officers worried about protocol, no men muttering about women overstepping their bounds. There were only scientists, men and women working side by side, united by a single purpose: win the war. Dr. Elizabeth Foster ran the facility with a combination of brilliance and compassion that Margaret had never encountered in the military. She listened to everyone's ideas, encouraged wild thinking, and created an environment where innovation flourished. We're not bound by tradition here, Elizabeth explained on Margaret's first day. The Navy gave me complete autonomy as long as we produce results, and we will produce results. Margaret was assigned to a team developing acoustic homing torpedoes, weapons that could track submarines by the sound of their engines. It was challenging work, requiring precise calculations and endless testing. Margaret threw herself into it completely, working 12-hour days, sometimes longer. She made friends with her teammates, a young mathematician named Sarah, an older engineer called James who had worked at Bell Laboratories before the war, and a Navy lieutenant named Michael who actually listened when she talked and valued her opinions. For the first time since joining the service, Margaret felt like she belonged. But the success of the bubble curtain system continued to follow her. Every few weeks, she received reports of convoys that had crossed the Atlantic safely, ships that had survived because of her invention. Each report was a reminder that her work mattered, that the struggle had been worth it. In April 1943, she received a letter from Betty. Her brother, the one on the destroyer, had made it home safely after 12 convoy runs. He said your bubbles saved his life 3 times, Betty wrote. He wants to meet you someday to say thank you. We all want to thank you. Margaret kept the letter in her desk drawer and read it whenever she felt discouraged. The acoustic torpedo project progressed rapidly. By June, they had a working prototype. The test results were promising. The torpedo could track a target submarine with remarkable accuracy. But there was a problem. The weapon sometimes locked onto the wrong target, especially in areas with multiple ships. Margaret worked on the problem for weeks, running simulation after simulation. The solution finally came to her at 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and was reviewing data in her quarters. The torpedo needed a way to distinguish between different sound signatures, to know the difference between a U-boat's diesel engines and a surface ship's propellers. She designed a filtering system that could analyze the frequency and pattern of sounds, essentially teaching the torpedo to recognize its prey. When she presented the solution to the team, even Elizabeth Foster was impressed. "This is revolutionary," Elizabeth said, studying Margaret's calculations. "If this works, our torpedoes will be 10 times more effective." "If it works, we'll end the U-boat threat," Margaret said quietly. They tested the improved torpedo in August. It worked perfectly, tracking and hitting a target submarine-shaped drone with pinpoint accuracy, even when decoy noises were introduced. The Navy immediately ordered production of the new torpedoes. They would be designated Mark 24, though within the research community, they were called Hayes torpedoes. Margaret was promoted to commander and awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. It was the highest honor a woman had ever received in the naval service. The ceremony took place in Washington, with Admiral Hardcastle pinning the medal to her uniform. Reporters were there, flashbulbs popping. Margaret hated the attention, but she understood its importance. She was proving that women could contribute at the highest levels of warfare. After the ceremony, Admiral Hardcastle pulled her aside. "Commander Hayes, I have something to tell you. Captain Morse has been removed from his position at the research facility." Margaret felt a complicated mix of emotions. What happened? An investigation found that he had blocked or delayed 17 significant research projects over 6 months, all because the lead researchers were either women or civilian scientists he viewed as outsiders. The Navy estimates his obstruction may have cost us hundreds of lives. The Admiral's face was grim. "He's been reassigned to a supply depot in Alaska. And the projects he blocked, being revived. In fact, several are showing great promise now that they're being properly supported." Margaret nodded slowly. She should have felt vindicated, but mostly she just felt tired. How many other Captain Morses were out there, wasting talent and costing lives because of their prejudices? "There's more," the Admiral said. "The Secretary of the Navy wants to establish a program to identify and promote qualified women in technical fields. They've asked you to help design it." Margaret looked up sharply. "Me? Who better? You fought this battle from the inside. You know what needs to change." It was a daunting responsibility, but also an opportunity to make sure other women wouldn't face what she had faced. "I'll do it," Margaret said. Over the next year, as the war in the Atlantic turned in favor of the Allies, Margaret worked on 2 parallel tracks. She continued her research in San Diego, developing new anti-submarine technologies. But she also traveled to naval bases across the country, identifying talented women who were being underutilized, advocating for their promotion, and creating training programs to prepare more women for technical roles. She met resistance, of course. There were still many men in the Navy who believed women had no place in warfare. But the tide was turning. The bubble curtain system and the acoustic torpedoes had saved too many lives for anyone to deny the value of women's contributions. By early 1945, when Germany was on the verge of defeat, Margaret had helped place over 200 women in scientific and technical positions throughout the Navy. Some were engineers, others mathematicians, still others specialists in radio technology or cryptography. One of those women was a young lieutenant named Grace Hopper, a mathematician who would go on to revolutionize computer programming. Years later, Grace would tell Margaret, "You opened the door. All we had to do was walk through it." The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The U-boat threat, which had once seemed insurmountable, had been decisively beaten. The combination of improved tactics, better technology, and Margaret's innovations had turned the Atlantic from a graveyard into a highway for Allied supplies. When the casualty figures were finally compiled, naval historians estimated that the bubble curtain system alone had saved over 15,000 lives. Sailors who would have died if not for those simple curtains of air bubbles rising through the water. After the war ended, Margaret was offered a position at the Naval Research Laboratory, heading up the acoustics division. She accepted and spent the next 20 years advancing the science of underwater sound, training a new generation of researchers, and continuing to fight for opportunities for women in science. She never married. Her work was her life, and she made peace with that choice. She maintained friendships with Dorothy, Betty, and Patricia. All three had survived the war and often got together to reminisce about their days in the Norfolk mess hall. "We've come a long way from peeling potatoes," Dorothy said at one of these reunions in 1950. "You've come a long way," Betty corrected. "We're just along for the ride." "No," Margaret said firmly. "You all stood by me when it would have been easier to keep your heads down. You were willing to be punished for supporting me. That took real courage." In 1960, Margaret retired from the Navy as a captain, the highest rank she could achieve without a traditional military career path. She received numerous honors, including being inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame for her work on anti-submarine technology. But her proudest moment came in 1965, when the Navy named a research vessel after her, the USNS Margaret Hayes. It was the first ship ever named for a woman scientist. At the christening ceremony, now 75 years old, Margaret stood before a crowd of naval officers, scientists, and former sailors whose lives she had saved. She thought about all the struggles, all the times she had been dismissed and mocked and told she didn't belong. In her speech, she said, "There were many times I wanted to quit, times when it seemed impossible that anything would change. But I kept going because I knew that somewhere out there were young girls who would face the same barriers I faced, and I wanted them to know that those barriers could be broken." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "Someone once told me I was just a cook with crazy ideas, but here's what I learned: there's no such thing as just anything. Everyone has value, everyone has potential, and sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that change the world." Among the crowd, she spotted David Chen, now a rear admiral. He was standing with his daughter, who wore an ROTC uniform from MIT. After the ceremony, the young woman approached Margaret. "Admiral Chen, my father told me that you saved his brother's life during the war, and he said you inspired him to believe that anyone could make a difference, regardless of what others thought." Margaret felt tears in her eyes. "Your father helped me when I had no one else. He was braver than he knows." "He says the same about you," the young woman replied. "I'm studying engineering because of people like you, because you proved it was possible." Margaret took her hand. "Then make sure you prove it to the next generation. Keep the door open for those who come after." That evening, Margaret stood alone on the pier, looking at the ship that bore her name. It was a beautiful vessel, sleek and modern, equipped with the latest acoustic technology that had its roots in the work she had done over 20 years earlier. She thought about Thomas, her brother who had died so young. She thought about the thousands of sailors who had come home to their families because of a simple idea she'd had while watching water boil. She thought about all the women who now had opportunities that hadn't existed before. The struggle hadn't always been fair. There had been times when the injustice of it all had nearly broken her. But she had persisted, and in persisting, she had changed not just her own life but the lives of countless others. The cook's crazy invention had indeed kept German U-boats from finding Allied convoys. But more than that, it had proven that genius and courage could come from the most unexpected places, even from a woman working in a kitchen, armed with nothing but knowledge, determination, and an unwavering belief that she deserved to be heard. As the sun set over San Diego Harbor, casting golden light across the water, Margaret smiled. She had spent her life fighting to be taken seriously, to be valued for her mind rather than dismissed for her gender. And she had won. Not just for herself, but for every woman who would come after her, every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough, smart enough, or worthy enough to make a difference. The barriers were broken, the door was open, and the future was full of possibilities.